Hello, everyone, and welcome to the online edition of Senseability magazine. My name is Seth Dellinger. I'm with the Feldenkrais Guild of North America's Communications Board, and I'm delighted to be with Chrish Kresge today. Welcome, Chrish.
Thank you, Seth. Welcome to you too. It's great to be here. Great to see you.
Yeah, I happen to know Chrish because we're both in Washington, D.C., and Chrish is a Feldenkrais practitioner as well as an Anat Baniel Neuromovement practitioner. And we're going to be talking about working with kids today, but I've been lucky enough to lie on the table and get sessions with Chrish, and she's a wonderful practitioner. 3 decades of experience. She's taught in many countries around the world. She is also an actor and theater director, and here it is, co-editor of this book, The Feldenkrais Method, Learning Through Movement. And you can sort of get a sense, many different articles by many different practitioners about the many wonderful things that the Feldenkrais Method can do. But we want to talk about working with children, and maybe you could just introduce us to how Feldenkrais Method and Anat Baniel Neuromovement can help kids.
Sure. Yeah, I actually first started working when I was fresh out of my first training when I was living in Morocco. And I really didn't know what I was doing, but people, a lot of people there are some issues you often find in some third world countries that there are a lot more, for whatever reason, a lot more special needs children. And so people started bringing me their kids, and somehow I muddled through and made a difference. I mean, now 30 years later, I'm a different practitioner, but I think it's the fundamental principles of our work where we are, first of all, really moving slowly, getting the brain's attention. We're also using the ground, really relating to the ground, so that anytime a child, especially with special needs kids, they need to learn the importance of gravity and how they can find the support through the ground reaction forces that we learn in our Feldenkrais trainings, but mostly when people are working maybe with traditional physical therapy, those are the kinds of things that aren't emphasized as much. And I feel that they're very, very important. So, there are so many different presentations of children that come to us, from cerebral palsy to developmental delays to autism now. Autism is really growing, sadly.
Yeah.
And then so many different kind of, difficulties that have all kinds of, Fragile X syndrome. I mean, they're very, very specific difficulties in the brain. And of course, a lot of children have strokes, in utero strokes, that present then to give them, kind of hemiplegia. And so ultimately, we're not looking at like, what is the diagnosis for this child, but the child is a human being, and we work with human beings. That's what we do as Feldenkrais practitioners. And we apply, these principles regardless. And I think what's really important to emphasize for parents, prospective parents that maybe are having some difficulties or have a child with special needs, that the element of empathy, the element of connecting. And in fact, Anat Baniel, who's one of my teachers and is actually the founder of ABM Neuromovement, she really emphasizes that it's connection, not perfection. And it's connection, and actually one of the chapters in her book is called From Fixing to Connecting. So we don't fix a child. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's probably a long answer to your first question, Seth, but I just want to situate it in the work that the principles are very, very important. Mm-hmm. And actually, Anat has principles called the 9 essentials. They're essential movements that she talks about. And you can go online and look at them. They're very relevant for all of us. And they're things like slowing down, moving with awareness, moving with attention, not being too goal-oriented, trusting in subtlety, reducing the effort in order to have that wonderful sensation of making fine distinctions.
Right. So you're talking about both qualities of movement, but also qualities of learning, right? And when you mentioned the different, diagnoses that these children may have received, but that you're focused on who is this child in front of me and how can I connect to them. But what, separate from the actual diagnoses, what are some of the actual movement challenges that some of these children face, and how does Feldenkrais help them, to deal with those challenges and maybe in some cases surmount them?
Sure, sure. Yeah, no, they are fundamental challenges that in terms of just from development with a young baby may have great difficulty in rolling from its back to its stomach or from its stomach back to its back. Of course, crawling. I mean, these are all, sequentially as you go along, at 2 months, a baby should be able to lift his head. But again, in our work, we're not looking for the milestones to be as important as maybe the pediatrician might say, well, they're 6 months and they're still not sitting up or rolling over. Because we take the child where they're at. So I think that the crawling, of course, the walking are something that the parents are always want their children to be able to walk. I mean, just this week, I've had like 2 new children and the parents want the child to walk, but the child cannot walk and it cannot learn to walk by walking. So often people will put them in the stander, the walker, or the parents will hold them and pull them along. And actually, nothing could be worse because they're learning the experience of difficulty. And so in our work, we're really wanting to create the conditions where the learning is pleasurable, effortless, easy, and that the brain experiences that as something that's delicious, wonderful, and that the child can actually, without needing to have approval of the parent or the teacher or the therapist, can feel good on their own even when they're rolling from the back to the belly and they lift their head. It's like a whole new world. And the parents don't even need to say bravo, but they do. And that makes it that they become dependent and almost needy for the approval. So that's one of the things that I think that Moshe modeled very well, is that, he wasn't like, you did a great job. Maybe they did, but to actually imbue the child themselves with a feeling of, hey, I'm not so bad. I'm pretty good, even if it's a small baby. But of course, older kids as well, and children who have autism. And you and I worked together with a young man who had autism, and it's very, very challenging. But at the same time, when you distill it into making fine distinctions and having the person really feel what they are doing in real time. So often I'll not encourage a lot of toys to be in the room. It's nice to distract the child, but at the same time, it's a distraction from the brain. I have lots of toys and books here, but I actually rarely use them because I want this baby, this child, to be fully present in what they're doing, curious and remaining connected to themselves and to me, of course, and to the parent.
So it sounds like, in addition to the movements that you're practicing, you're really conscious about your relationship to the child and almost standing in to create a potential new pattern of socialization from what they've experienced as a child with various challenges and the other experiences they may have had with, traditional medicine and whatnot.
Yeah, no, beautifully put. That's exactly right. I think maybe it's not articulated enough in our training, is that this whole connection thing is vital with no matter whether we're working a child or an adult, but to really connect on the level where the person is seen. And there are many stories of people that felt that they were seen by Dr. Feldenkrais. They felt for the first time in their life they were seen. And it was that sense of, I get you. I'm here for you. I get you. And I don't need to help you. You don't need to need me, but we're connecting and I see you in your beauty, in your full potential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, beautiful. When you were talking about the emotional reaction sometimes from the parents around what the kid is doing, I actually remember that Feldenkrais, in his book, The Potent Self, he writes about this and how, it can set up this situation where, so it's like we learn movements in our development as children, but we also learn associations with them. And at the same time, what's really interesting, and I know you work with adults as well, is that often in the Feldenkrais method, adults are being asked to do developmental movements to improve their experience in their bodies as adults. Can you talk about
Yes.
a little bit about that connection?
Yes, it's one of my favorite things to do. Actually, just today, as a matter of fact, I taught a lesson this morning to my students, and kind of knowing what I was going to do this interview this afternoon, I thought, well, I'm just going to go through the gentle little cycle of developmental movements, from rolling onto the belly, and obviously super acceleration from like 2 months to almost a year. But what was so fascinating, almost to a person, everybody in the class go, oh my gosh, I feel so different. I'm standing so differently. But all we did was roll around. And I often do a wall scan where they're standing against the wall to see how they are in the vertical. It's in my vitality class. And they're like, oh, how come all this folding and rolling we did, and yet I'm standing straighter?
Mm.
So it's beautiful to work with adults in developmental movements. And on that note, I really want to make sure that I emphasize that the importance of the parent to be involved in the work, and if possible, take lessons, get lessons. Many of the parents of special needs children end up taking the training. So for example, in my Anat Baniel Method Neuromovement training, which I did twice for children, and probably a third, at least a third, if not a half, of the people in the room learning were the parents of special needs children, and often would go on to actually teach it as well. But this was just to help support their child. But they themselves, we all made such huge, incredible leaps in our thinking, our creativity, our capacity to imagine, to move, and to again have this sense of self.
Mm-hmm.
This the self-image, how through movement the self-image can be built, enhanced, and that feeling of, like I said earlier, you know what, I'm pretty good.
Mm.
It's a great feeling.
Yeah. So when you have a new client who's a child, obviously you're going to meet their parents as well. Can you describe a little bit of that whole dynamic of
Yes.
you were just talking
I
about?
mean, it often goes really, really rough in the beginning, because they have this idea, they've been doing PT, pediatric PT, and they think I'm just going to fix their kid. And often they'll come and they'll just put the child on the table and sit back and, try to take out their iPhone. And I'm like, no, you guys have to be involved. This is your
Uh-huh.
lesson as much as your child's lesson.
Mm.
And it takes a while because they haven't really felt those feelings in their own bodies. And so they can't even imagine. And often, even in the very first lesson, I'll get the parent to lie on their back and just roll around a little bit. And they're actually exhausted after it. A baby, after doing a little rolling around and trying to get to the next stage, is exhausted, and they understand what their child, who can't even do that in many cases, is going through. So then they develop a different kind of an empathy, which is not a feeling sorry for, but just a kind of, wow, yeah, I see you, So anyway, I do encourage the parents to be involved on that level of really participating. Many of them resist it. And then when they do, they're like, oh, right, I get it. It's really important.
Yeah.
So
So
the
it's
other
an
thing that, yeah, let me just say, the other
yeah,
thing that
yeah,
is
go
really
on.
important to persuade the parents that there's a big difference between traditional pediatric and other kinds of physical therapy and what we do in Feldenkrais and ABM&M. Because there is no repetition. We don't do repetition. We don't do 10 of these and 5 of these. Because the moment you do that, your mind goes into an automatic state. You just kind of distance. You're counting, you're wishing it was over, you're not really enjoying it very much. And I'm sort of exaggerating a little bit in terms of PT because it's evolved a lot. But in our lessons with children, working the way we work, we don't even know what we're going to do. We're not going to like go there, I think I'll do this particular lesson with this particular child. No, because we want to see what's on our table, what's on our floor, and go from there. And that's a bit of a shock for parents. The other thing is that we tend to encourage a lot of lessons in a cluster of 5, 6, 7, 8 lessons, and then to take a break for the brain to integrate the work. And that is beautiful. It's a beautiful way to work.
Mm.
So now that I've
No, 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 that's great.
time on this
I'm
question.
glad I didn't jump in too soon. So, it's possible someone watching this video might not be so familiar with the Feldenkrais method, and I think you've begun to paint that picture. But maybe they've gotten curious because the method is known for how it can help children. And maybe, they have a young child and they're just observing their child and they have some questions because in the early going, we don't always know what's going on with kids. They're not obviously articulating their experience to us the way we do as adults. So what would you say to a parent of a young child who might have some questions of, like, as you mentioned, are they meeting the developmental milestones, or what are some of the things to just sort of look out for, even if you're not a trained, movement practitioner, but you're a parent with your child?
Excellent question. Excellent question. So, one of the things that's almost universal really is eye contact. If your child is not making eye contact with you and really being able to hold your gaze without the eyes moving in different directions, because the eyes organize, the eyes say so much about who we are and what we are in our own organization. So I think that is definitely a sign, I could even say a warning sign possibly. I think also for a small baby, needless to say, their pediatricians are probably always frequently will say, they haven't met their milestones, but to also trust your own instinct, that the parent actually, they don't trust their own instinct. They listen to the pediatricians and they're wonderful. Of course, they need to listen to them, but at the same time, they need to take on their own curiosity, their own instincts and their capacity to observe their child and to witness actually. And that will often lead them into knowing what's the right thing to do. Not always, but often. A baby needs to be able to roll over, onto its belly at some point. That doesn't mean you put a baby into its belly and hope for the best. On the contrary, tummy time is something that we don't encourage. Mostly, I don't know any practitioner of this work who says, "Oh, put the baby on the tummy and they'll learn to lift their head." Mainly, they just smash their faces into this pillow. So I would say absolutely not. But it's definitely an issue if a baby can't roll over either from the tummy back to its back or from the back to its tummy. Lifting the head, very important. You have to be able to lift your head to look around and see where you are in the environment. And maybe to be aware, I think a lot of new parents do this. They think that the baby needs to be on a soft surface, like a soft bed and a soft pillow, because the baby's so delicate. Babies are not delicate. They're incredibly resilient. And the firmer the support you give them, the more they can learn, the more they can find the skeletal support and not have to rely on tensing their muscles, which is what happens in cerebral palsy and some other issues. So I think that the parents need to kind of take ownership a little bit and really trust their gut, because usually they're right. I've heard this time and time again. Parents come and they think, I think there's something, I think there's something going on. And indeed, they're absolutely right. So, but eye contact is a big one. And when they start improving, one of the signs that things are getting better is eye contact. It's like, oh, wow, and then to acknowledge that, not to say bravo, but just like, I see that you're looking at me. Wow, this feels so good, because it's like a gift.
Right, right. And you mentioned this earlier, but I know when my daughter was young, I had this idea that would come up like, oh, how is my daughter gonna do this, that, and the other thing before another kid? Like there is, I think, something in our culture that, we get excited. We want to be proud of our kids or something, but there's a danger, is what I'm hearing from you, in trying to accelerate things.
There really is. There really is. It's probably one of the most difficult things to persuade parents and even our students. They always want to go a lot faster. But the parents of kids that have difficulties, in a sense, have already been stigmatized a little bit. Your child is special, it's different. And so they're even more eager to get their kids, but even typical kids get pushed too much. First children almost always are really
Right.
Encouraged to sit too soon, or if they put the baby in sitting, hoping that the baby will learn to sit.
Mhm.
No, the baby has to learn to go from its back to rolling to the side to coming up to side sitting, and boom, suddenly something great has happened. But if they're just put into sitting, and I mean, thousands of parents do this. They put their child in the high chair and they expect this is where they're sitting. It's not true. They really need to learn the hard, human beings develop, as you know, as we know, they develop in the most slow way, even slower than any other mammal. We take a year to reach maturation to even be able to stand and walk.
Mhm.
And then all the rest of it, I mean, really a fully developed human being is really not till maybe they're 20, 21, you know? So it's a long process, but that's why we are learners. We can learn and we can improve at any age and at any stage.
Mm.
Isn't that exciting? I mean, it's at any stage, a human being can still improve. It's not like a dog being able to learn tricks. It's really the capacity to learn, to make distinctions, to learn how also to not be to inhibit, inhibition is something that we have to learn also, this is with special needs kids a lot, even with cerebral palsy, the inhibition is inhibiting that spasticity. Is very, very important and difficult to achieve.
Yeah. So you've worked with a lot of kids, I know, and just to sort of give a little more of a sense of some of the different themes we've been talking about, I wonder if you could share with us just a story or two about maybe some of the kids that you've enjoyed working with. I know you've mentioned a couple times working with kids with cerebral palsy. Is there
Yes.
an example there?
And I really, I enjoy working with all the kids, even when it's really hard. I really do enjoy my work a lot. And I think that's important. But one particular boy that comes to mind, he's actually almost famous. He's a Turkish boy. He's the son of one of my colleagues at ABMN. And I started working with him after a few months, maybe a couple of years after he was diagnosed with cerebral palsy, and basically diagnosed saying that your son is never going to thrive. He's never going to walk. He's never going to talk. And his brain is little more than a vegetable. These were the words that the mother had to hear. Wouldn't happen nowadays, probably wouldn't happen in North America, but it did happen. And this boy has had many lessons from many, many different practitioners. And he is now walking, talking. He wants to be a politician. He's probably one of the more intelligent children I've ever met in my life. And at times it was a struggle to work with him because, the spasticity was very, very strong. But slowly, many lessons, much patience and love from his mother and his father. But he's made it, and he's now really thriving. And he's like, for me, just a perfect story of literally going from a dire diagnosis to being a fully fledged, capable, competent human being. It takes time, but it's possible,
So when you're working with a kid like that, and also the parents have sort of been primed to have such low expectations, it sounds like you're just going to have to change the context, I imagine, completely from what they would normally do, and like what you mentioned before about slowing things down and just working. And also I imagine that even though people might be imagining some sort of therapy or movement, like it's you're working with a kid, so that it's playful also. Is that right?
Absolutely playful, yeah, and encouraging even the parents to not be in kind of therapy mode, but playful also. So getting on the floor, rolling around, I mean, all these things that parents can do with their kids, there couldn't be anything better, really. And that's hard to encourage adults to become playful again. But that's where actually the Anat's 9 essentials are wonderful. They're just like a little list of all the things that people need to pay attention to. And often we'll ask the parents, work on just one essential per week. How about this week we just work on slowing down? Or how about we work on using the imagination, right? Again, like Einstein said, when someone uses their imagination, their brain is working at its highest possible capacity. Imagining. and dreaming and all of these things are part of what we really use. So wait, did I answer your question?
Yeah, no, I was just trying to get a sense of, how play comes in, and curiosity,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
imagination. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
And I was asking you about some of the kids you've worked with. You mentioned the young Turkish boy. I
That was
know you
memory.
mentioned to
Yeah.
me that sometimes kids who have different kind of attention deficit kind of situations, has that been?
It's more and more frequent in a funny way. I kind of have to say sometimes it's TV and iPhone and iPad that does, I think it makes it harder for the kids. But I've had actually a lot of success working with children with ADHD, attention deficit disorder. And it's, of course, about slowing down, but it's also meeting them where they are. And sometimes they can only be super intense. So instead of trying to correct them and say, you got to go slow all the time, you could also use amplification to kind of match them where they are. And so that they can start making these fine distinctions. We have a law, Weber-Fechner law, which is, for example, the idea that if you're in bright sunshine and you turn on a flashlight, you won't be able to detect that difference. So these children have a lot of noise in their brain, and we need to reduce the noise by slowing down. But sometimes in order to slow down, we need them to know that they're going fast, that they're actually, whatever they do, they shout a lot, they move around too fast, some of them are, it's just incredible. I mean, it's exhausting to be with them. But the minute they notice that they are doing something that you're mimicking them and you're asking them to do a little bit less, a little bit more, they've made that tiny distinction. They've made that difference. And that's the difference that makes a difference, is when they can tell, oh, there's this and there's this, and that's hard for the practitioner, but that's kind of the way to work. That's very, very effective. And also getting the buy-in of the parents, that they have to kind of trust the process. That's maybe the hardest thing of all.
Sure. Yeah. I was imagining just now that your theater background probably comes in handy sometimes when you're working.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. I think it probably does, being able to, amplify and modify and play.
Right.
Imagine. Yeah.
Well, this has been wonderful just to learn more about what you do and how, Feldenkrais and Anat Baniel Neuromovement, how these wonderful processes can help kids. And I don't know if there's just any final words you might want to share, especially with any parents who, are just learning about these possibilities before we.
Oh, I would say
close.
Absolutely. Really look into Feldenkrais, look into Anat Baniel Neuromovement. And you can't go wrong. Even if you just try it and you feel like it's not for me, you're still going to learn something. You're still going to improve yourself and your child. It's very potent. It's staggeringly potent. Many physical therapists are now doing the trainings because they've learned that that's helping them as well. So they can combine physical therapy. And of course, that means that they can also use insurance. So that's a big problem for many parents, is they don't want to, pay the private fees that we have to charge because we don't take insurance. So that's something to note. It's important. But all the more reason to just really scout around and find somebody that you connect with, and the possibilities are just limitless, really. And I want to thank you for your lovely questions, and it's so nice being interviewed by someone who actually knows what I'm talking about, because I've been interviewed before and I have to explain the whole method from scratch. Very nice.
Well, it's wonderful. It's wonderful to do the interview with you. I can't help but think about, there's even been a couple of occasions where you've worked with my daughter, who's now a teenager, and she's not dealing with questions that we've dealt with here, but she sure is a kid growing up, and she's received wonderful support from you on many occasions. So anyway,
she's
pleasure to be with you today.
Okay, Seth, thanks a lot.
Thanks so much.